I'd like to bring Nick into the conversation. And by the way, if you guys want to jump in and add anything to our conversation with the panelists, feel free to do it. Nick, first of all, thanks for being with us. And I'd like to ask you, Lula, Bruna, she mentioned that Lula is doing this sort of freestyle diplomacy, which is a throwback to that quote unquote active and upstanding diplomacy that it was the model of his diplomacy during his first 8 years in office. Do you agree with Bruna's reading? How do you see this kickoff of Lula's diplomacy this time around?
Well, Gustavo, again, thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure to be with so many experts and on such a great occasion, marking 100 days of a new democratically elected government. I am a native, born and raised of New York City, the birthplace of hip hop. So for me, freestyle means something improvised, and under that interpretation, I don't think that the approach thus far in terms of Lula's foreign policy has been one of improvisation or freestyle. I do think it's been, to Bruno's point, quite active and in fact effective, intense, and trying to deliver our message of Brazil being back on the global stage. But for the most part, with some key differences, both the intensity of the foreign policy approach and the trajectory of its focus are not terribly surprising. We saw President-elect Lula head to the COP. Bruna and others mentioned how climate diplomacy and multilateral climate negotiations, green finance, and the rest will be one of the pillars of Brazil's new foreign policy. And we saw that as he traveled, of course, to participate along with the folks who ultimately composed his cabinet, along with Environment Minister Marina Silva. And then we saw the first traditional trip, prioritizing the region, right? He goes to Buenos Aires, he stops in Montevideo to talk about Mercosur, right? But the first emphasis on sort of, Latin American and South American integration. More recently, we've seen Brazil returning to UNASUR. It's always prioritized that under most governments, if not the last one. Then we saw the visit to Washington, and of course, as it has been mentioned, the trip to Beijing, actually leaving later today. And I think that we see a lot of the core traditional tenets, pillars of Brazilian foreign policy coming back to the fore. Not that all of them were completely abandoned during the Bolsonaro administration, though some of them were. But again, we've seen a lot more talk about the need for the reform of the United Nations and the multilateral system. We're seeing a return to, or maybe for the first time, a really more vocal environmental advocacy, not just in terms of the old multilateral cleavages about the need for the developed world to pay up, but also some new initiatives like working with Indonesia and Congo, the potential to negotiate, carbon markets with China, are some new details, right? And then, of course, the age-old push or emphasis on establishing more of a multipolar, quote unquote, order in the parlance of Itamaraty, the Brazilian foreign ministry, that has as one tenet a world that's less U.S. dominant in this post-Cold War era.
And Nick, if I may jump in, I'm sorry, but one of the key aspects where we see this push for a more multipolar world order is all of Brazil's approach to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, right? And in that sense, Brazilian diplomacy hasn't changed that much from what the stance Brazil had during the Bolsonaro administration, a position of neutrality, a formal position of neutrality, and Brazilian diplomats trying to lobby in the UN for softer language on Russia and trying to claim that an overt condemnation of Russia would be a major roadblock to peace negotiations. So how do you see Lula's approach to the war?
So as I was about to say, Gustavo, indeed, the push for that multipolar order at a time while Europe is at war, U.S.-China tensions just seemingly keep rising. Brazil has, re-emphasized again BRICS at a time when, of course, BRICS has as its member Russia, which is the aggressor in said European war, is perhaps what is new and tricky here. It's not that it's a departure from Bolsonaro per se, and in fact, I said there was some continuity there in places, but it's just more broadly that the world is new, and so the implications of Brazil's return to a diplomatic tradition where it tries to play all of the major powers off of each other to advance a uniquely Brazilian interest, it looks a bit different than perhaps the last time Lula was president in ways that I think are problematic in terms of the approach and this push to be a peacemaker in the first 100 days when it comes to Ukraine, I think what we're really seeing is a head of state who is motivated by legacy. I don't think we can ever forget about the broader trajectory of Lula, the heights that he climbed when he was first president, leaving office with nearly 80% approval ratings, having taken tens of millions of Brazilians out of extreme poverty, to the corruption charges that followed and the depths that he sank to include being imprisoned. And I think that whether we're talking about economic, domestic policy, or foreign policy, a frame for understanding Lula 3.0 is he wants to get back to where he left the last time around. And he sees Ukraine and inserting Brazil into that process as a key mediator, I think, is part of that, enshrining Brazil's rebirth and Lula's resurrection on the global stage. I don't think it's surprising or difficult to understand that Brazil would want and should have a role in some eventual negotiation. I hope we get there as a leader of the global South. I think what's much more problematic is the way that Lula and his advisors have gone about trying to message that. It's misguided, in my opinion, and it's creating increasing and unnecessary offense in Western capitals. There is an undercurrent in Lula's rhetoric, in National Security Advisor Celso Amorim's rhetoric, in Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira's rhetoric, that that Washington and perhaps parts of Europe are warmongers somehow. That they brought this war in some measure upon itself. I think part of this is the hangover and the legacy of the Iraq War coming home to roost. That the United States has lost a lot of credibility in the world, and people are concerned about its intentions. So it's very easy as a talking point from the Brazilian government to brag, quote unquote, about being a country of peace, pointing to its decisions to deny munitions that could be useful to the Ukrainians and kind of cutting the conversation off there as a talking point. But I think the question that that's raising in Washington and in Brussels and in other European capitals is, does engagement with Putin via US and EU channels to prevent the war, which we see dating back to mid 2021 when Biden and Putin met in Geneva, when Bill Burns, the CIA director, travels to meet with Putin in November, and they're snubbed. So, does that type of engagement, proactively trying to prevent a war, not receiving a strong encouragement from the Russians in response, and then if they had denied munitions to the Ukrainians, thereby facilitating essentially an easy military takeover of Ukraine, um, is that warmongering? Or is that trying to defend an aggrieved, invaded upon nation? And now, of course, most recently, we have a statement from Lula on Crimea that essentially Ukraine and President Zelensky should consider giving it up. And it is interesting, to say the least, to see a country like Brazil that holds its sovereignty so near and dear seemingly be so willing to negotiate away the territory and sovereignty of another. It also seems a bit simplistic. If the strategy is to endear Brasilia to Russia and China, precisely to serve as an interlocutor, it's the type of posture that doesn't engender trust in Washington and elsewhere. To simply bring "quote unquote" Ukraine along on a Brazilian envisioned initiative. Moreover, gifting Crimea officially to Russia has essentially been the world's policy since 2014. And where did that get us? It got us here. It doesn't seem like the accommodation of Putin has worked. It also seems far-fetched that Crimea as a concession would be enough to get a peace deal done, given how much Moscow has sacrificed in the process. And so it's befuddling, to say the least. And I think this is a space to watch as Brazil continues to take steps to usher in its resurgence on the global stage.
Yeah, I would add to Nick's understanding that this is not a consequence or a hangover from the Iraq War. This is essential to Workers' Party foreign policy decisions. This left wing ideology that is still informs Lula's foreign policy, and it's part of the same understanding that has informed the decision of removing visa waivers for U.S., Australian, Japanese, and Canadian citizens, which the Lula administration has announced it will do in October, because they demand reciprocity from the big Western powers, as opposed to taking into account whether or not there are hundreds of thousands of Americans crossing the border to live in Brazil and to work illegally in Brazil. So it's part of the same ideology, my understanding, that they're going to stand up to the Western powers and be closer to Russia and China, regardless whether or not if the Iraq war had never happened.
So I think you misunderstood my point a bit, Sede. Moreover, I don't think that all of these issues are mutually exclusive. I think one point that I was trying to make is, as the United States, this current administration, the Biden administration, has made a point of trying to rally the world of democracies to counter the invasion of a democratic country. One of the reasons why its credibility has been constrained in parts of the global South, not just Brazil, is because of the legacy and the hangover of the Iraq War. That you yourself, Washington, has a track record in the advance of your own national interest to invade other countries, right? And therefore, what makes this different? Is that the totality of the story? No. I think, but it's just one aspect of it. Though I agree with all of the points that you made as also being dynamics involved in the posture. Again, these things, as you know well, living and covering Brasilia, usually there are many motives and objectives involved in
Yeah.
how these things shake out.
And Nick, you mentioned that there is legitimacy in Brazil wanting to have this role, to play this role of a peacemaker. But the question to you is it realistic? Because I'm a skeptical of soft power. I think soft power stems from hard power. I remember, for instance, when Lula brokered a deal with Iran and Turkey. Some experts say that it was an even better deal to contain Iran at the time, but the U.S. Have had no regard for that deal, and Obama did his own deal with Iran afterwards. So, in at the time, Lula's efforts did little than put Brazil in an awkward position with the U.S. Do you think it is realistic for Brazil to want to have the central peacemaking role, considering that Brazil remains a peripheral country in the global stage, even if a global South power?
Well, I personally don't agree that Brazil is a peripheral actor in world affairs, period. And certainly not at a time where Europe is at war and it sits on the UN Security Council. So, Gustavo, with all due respect, part of the premise of your question, I have a different vision, and I think that we're seeing in a world of profound polarization between the United States and China, that the relative importance of the major global South countries is only growing in importance. So there's the current reality, the recent past, right, and the trajectory moving forward in the conflict that doesn't really seem like it's going to end anytime soon. And more importantly, a lot of the negative externalities from that, the breakdown in diplomacy at the UN, rising food prices, inflation, energy prices, all of it, right? It seems like it's here to stay. So I think that we need to engage a broader body of countries on how to address some of the fundamental challenges before the world, whether from climate to development to economic cooperation to, yes, questions of peace and security. So again, I think there is space for the Brazils and the Indias, and in fact, a need for these countries to do more. But then it becomes a question of how and where and what's the focus. And my point is that in the specifics, but not in the abstract, the ambition that Brazil has to play a productive, constructive role on the leading issues of the day, I think is very welcome and overdue and isn't a stretch. The problem is in the particulars thus far in these, a very, very small amount of time, 100 days, which we've seen a track record of false equivalency, some naivete, and frankly, a bit of an undercurrent. It seems that's almost anti-Ukraine, anti-West, and that specifically, I think, is more problematic and engenders a degree of mistrust, right? That can become a self-fulfilling prophecy of it not working out.
We'd like to introduce you to our latest release, our exclusive report on the first 100 days of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's third term as Brazilian president. Lula's 100 Days, Myriad Challenges and Unforced Errors is a valuable strategic tool that brings you in-depth analysis from our experts on the most important issues from the beginning of Lula's administration. In this exclusive report, you'll find insights and analysis on the government's support base in Congress, Brazil's return to foreign policy, fiscal, economic and environmental challenges, as well as how the administration is tackling social media regulation and planning to fight hunger. Don't miss this opportunity and use the coupon to get a 20% discount on the report. Enjoy your read.